So you've been involved with the St. Louis, like the community activism group for a while now. How did you start off with them? I mean, what brought you over there?
Yeah, actually, not to take too long on it, but it's sort of interesting. I think the way I got involved is my area of interest is primarily employment policy, work issues, and this sort of thing. Academically, we still are. And in 1990, I came here in '89, and so the first summer I was here, I'd been here a year. There was a program at MIT, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on problems in the American economy, and I had to go and went to this, and this is my real interest in all this sort of thing. So we got to this thing in this was July 1990, and there were probably about 20 people who had come to this. It was sort of like a symposium. It went on for a whole week, and we looked at various studies of the U.S. economy. So the first morning of this session started, and we were sitting in a classic sort of room with chairs sitting around sort of a half circle and all that, and I had sat in the front corner, and so the guy that was leading it, he came in and said, one of these, why don't we all introduce ourselves and say where you're from? And so I just said my name, and I said Alma, Michigan. And a guy in the group, another person in the group who was a professor at North Carolina State, and in sort of agricultural science, interrupted when I said this, and he said, basically, I'll never forget this line, he said, oh, if we want to study what's wrong in the American economy, we got to go to this guy's hometown. And I was like, what's he talking about? And then he went into like a 5-minute explanation of the chemical company.
Right.
And what was wrong. And, how their policies were, he thought they were representative of a certain segment of business, but he said, they had careless management in general, they had terrible labor relations, they were careless environmentally, and all this, and explained this cattle feed mistake that had been made, I think you've heard about, right, and all this. And so the whole rest of the time I was in Massachusetts, I talked to this guy, and it's like, what are you talking about? I didn't even know about this. I mean, I had no idea. All the site was in 1990 was this grass-covered mound with a fence around it. Well, anyway, when I came back, I started to ask people. This made me like really curious, and found out just casually a lot of information. And the next year, Alma was starting a thing to look at community, trying to get students involved in community service, and I was on the committee, and they were talking about it. So what would be a good topic, to get students involved? And I said, why don't we do something environmental? There's all this problem, and so in 1992 and 93, a chemistry professor and I got 6 students together to interview people about what had gone wrong, because it was coming up in the 20th anniversary of the cattle feed mistake. And so that's how I sort of got involved. And then, not to go too much further, it started to become clear that the cleanup hadn't worked back in the late 70s and early 80s, that it resulted from all this cattle feed error. And what happened was that in 1997, EPA announced they were going to have a public meeting in town to report on their findings, because they had found the fish were so contaminated and all this in the river. And so I, over the time since starting this thing back in 92, 93, and then I had occasionally had students sort of follow up and all this, and had gotten to know a couple of people at EPA in Chicago, and from talking to him about this, and it was one guy down there called and said, we're having this public meeting, the fish are so contaminated, and he said, how many people do you think would show up, and all this? And then I was like, so when's this meeting, and this sort of thing. I had a class that term in public affairs, and I sort of made them all go to this meeting, because I go, this will be great, you get to go, and you'll see a public meeting, and how government agencies try to interact with the public. It was standing room only. People were angry at EPA. It was fascinating, to be there. And it went on for like 4 hours. I mean, the EPA thought it was going to be like an hour meeting and all this, and they were not even picking on them. They were just not prepared. I mean, people, and you felt sorry for the EPA officials who hadn't been involved in the stuff in the 70s. They were all young, and, they were coming in to inform the community, and instead the community people were like up in arms. Why didn't you knew this was wrong? Why did you do this? And finally, after like 4 hours, this one guy from EPA said, well, sort of to a halt. It was like 11 at night, and people were still mad and still complaining. And he said, you people have the right to form an advisory group to the EPA for this site. And he said, says, anyone who would want to serve on it, I'll pass around a pad and just put your name down, and I'll arrange a meeting in a couple weeks, and you can talk about whether you want to go ahead with this. And so I put my name down, but the whole bunch of other people did, and they had this meeting. And when we got together, because we had been involved, we had interviewed a lot of these people in 92, 93, and when they were going around saying, well, who's going to chair this? And the current chair, Jane Keon, had come, and she said, well, why don't we make him the chair? It was all about the history of it. And so I was the chair before her. So, and then we got the group going.